This is Common Ground. My name is Sonja Wolf, and we're back with Professor Claudio Lomnitz to talk about the criminal economy and the state in Mexico. Welcome back, Claudio.
Thank you.
So in this episode, I wanted to ask you initially about what is called the war on drugs. It's a fact that Mexico has an internal armed conflict, but the authorities often portray this war in black and white terms, where the state is pitched against criminal groups, where the victims are pitched against perpetrators. You argue in your book that the war on drugs cannot be won or lost, but is a new way of governing. What do you mean by that?
Well, to my mind, wars, in order to be wars, sort of have to have the possibility of winning or losing. And when you're dealing with something like drugs, there's nothing that original about this, but I use the sort of idea of the pharmacon to think about that. That is, a drug is at the same time a poison, a remedy, and a scapegoat. So when you have something that has those properties, combines poison and remedy, combines poison, remedy, and scapegoat, it's possible to win a war against that. Because there are people, to make what I'm saying a little bit less abstract, if you're a peasant in a poppy growing region in the state of Guerrero, say, or in the state of Michoacán, or in the state of Sinaloa, then even though you know that the opium is somebody's poison, and in fact it is talked about it that way sometimes, it is also maybe what makes the peasant economy viable, because maybe you're a corn farmer and you need little small patches of opium poppy in order to just, survive over the year. So you can't just declare war on that unless you're going to substitute that economy and make it viable. And we haven't seen that. What we've seen is a military campaign. So a military campaign cannot substitute everything that the drug economy brings to Mexican society. Because it's not just combating a poison, it's also combating a remedy. And it's also not going to be winnable because the culprits of the bad guys, the criminals, whatever, in this equation also have political utility, that they can serve as scapegoats for all kinds of things whenever that is needed. So I don't believe that the formula of the war on drugs has any it's a formula that doesn't allow for any kind of conclusion. And because it cannot be won, in my view, it is, in that sense, not a war.
In the book, you talk a little bit about the ambiguities in the contemporary violence. And in that sense, I would like to turn for a moment to the perpetrators. When we look at criminal groups, we can perhaps understand that there are perpetrators on different levels. You suggest in your book that they are not simply perpetrators, but that they can also be understood as protectors and benefactors. In what way can we understand this dual role of perpetrators as not simply the perpetrators of violence, but also benefactors or protectors?
I think that if you go back to the literature that was developing in folklore studies, anthropology, history, and journalism as well, in the 1980s, 90s, when you started getting the first kind of narco corridos, the first ballads that were the first sort of developments of a popular culture around the drug economy, there were a number of writers who were using Eric Hobsbawm, famous British historian's notion from his, I guess, 1960s book, a very old book, but very influential, about social bandits. And the question was whether some of these heroes of these ballads, like Rafael Caro Quintero, for example, who was the subject of many, many ballads in that time, could be seen as social bandits. And in part, there was always evidence that could be marshaled in favor of that argument. People like Caro Quintero would, paid for, whatever, paving a road to his community or subsidizing a school. Or recently, we just had there was a scandal in the town of Cualcomán in Michoacán just a month or two ago, maybe 3 months ago, because the municipal president, in a sort of festival, they put out a school festival. They put out, banners thanking El Mencho, the head of the Jalisco cartel, for the gifts that he gave to the children of the school. So that is having some kind of redistributive function is not unusual, but in many of these figures, and many of them, in fact, actually cultivate quite a lot a sense of popular identification, that they come from the people, and that, in fact, their own sort of vindications, they stand for a kind of popular vindication. That's not entirely wrong. But what is wrong is that the shape of these economies, of the economies that have been built, first of all, they are very often transnational economies, and in any case, they're very, very often sort of wide regional economies. And as a result, the same person who can distribute build a school in his hometown, can basically be a slaver in the state next door, or be operating as a businessman in LA or in the US. So that those kinds of stable characterizations of, especially the leadership in these new economies, are all a little bit shaky, because they often fixate only on one dimension of what it takes in order to articulate a business of that nature. And that's what I think you're talking about. That is, yes, there are questions of protection that are, well, first of all, there is a protection racket that emerges as these groups become more and heavily armed. And that now today is a huge business, right? The business of protection. But even when they weren't, like in the 1980s, 90s, they weren't yet as, they didn't have armies the way they have now. Even then, there were protective functions that they had, both political protection and sort of armed protection, that have always been valorized. It's a little bit not so different from the logic of some of the gangs that you've written about. That is, the gangs that emerged, Central American gangs that emerged in California in the 1980s, 90s, emerged, first of all, as a form of protection and neighborhood protection and all of that. And that function still exists in the gangs. It's not the only thing that they do, but it is part of what they do. And this is important because protection is related to a key thing that has been happening these past decades, which is the decentralization, the government's loss of its ability to regulate various economies in various public spaces in various territories, and in some way, one might think of this as a process of privatization of the security, and the security is privatized, and policing and all that. Public policing is limited. It's supplemented by a huge amount of private policing, but it's also supplemented by a huge amount of organized crime policing or gang policing. So that is the kind of geography that we inhabit today, where there really are a multiplicity of actors who are capable or incapable or trying to vying for the assertion of violent capacity to regulate.
There's a recurrent idea that is associated perhaps mostly with President López Obrador, the previous administration, whereby the violence in Mexico can be attributed to a torn social fabric. And we know that President López Obrador also claimed that the perpetrators of the violence lack values, that it's necessary to preserve the family. How useful is it to think about a torn social fabric when we want to understand the violence, and how useful are these appeals to preserve the family?
In my view, in the analysis that I put forward in this book that we're discussing, you have had in Mexico over the past 40 years or so something that we still don't entirely understand. We don't know enough about it, but it's clearly there. We know enough to know that it's there, which is some kind of a moral revolution, but a moral revolution understood not just as a, quote, torn social fabric, though there's plenty of tear that happens when you have a deep transformation. I mean it, this moral revolution, in a very simple way, which is morality is related to mores. In other words, morality is related to the ethically sanctioned habits. And in a society that transforms very rapidly, which is what you've had in Mexico over the past 40 years, deep economic change, deep social change, deep demographic change, deep technological change, etc., then you're going to have changing habits. And once you have changing habits, you're going to have a moral revolution of some kind. The fact that it's not yet well articulated, that it doesn't yet have its clear ideologues, that it isn't yet, quite yet, an open philosophy or something like that, does not make the process of transformation any less significant. It just makes it harder to apprehend. So that kind of situation of sort of tumultuous change lends itself to a discourse about torn social fabric. The discourse of torn social fabric is interesting because it's shared across a wide spectrum that you would think would make odd bedfellows. That is, López Obrador supposedly was a politician of the left, but the torn social fabric discourse is really much more of a religious discourse, much more popular in the church, for example. And the fact is that you have an allegedly leftist president standing up for family values, and it's claiming that the problem of a drug economy that employs, by the way, has more employees than Walmart, is a huge portion of the Mexican economy, or not a huge, but significant portion. It's not a tribute. It's not three people. You're talking about, tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands, perhaps, people who are connected to this economy. that you might think that it's a matter of getting their mothers out there to kind of remind them of their filial duties is a very questionable form of public policy. No question. That's what I think. But it is actually quite effective as political ideology. This is not different from, I mean, if we think about the first war on drugs that I do think is actually much more deeply relevant for the Mexican story than the Mexican war on drugs is Ronald Reagan's war on drugs in the 1980s in the US. That is more directly related to the whole history that we're talking about, because it is that moment when you have, increased incarceration in the U.S. and therefore, let's say, increased power of the gangs in the U.S. and then later transnationally as they're deported back to Central America or as people move back and forth between Mexico and these American cities. So the Reagan war on drugs went along with what a movement that was known at that time as the moral majority, which was a familistic movement where that imagined that the decadence that was manifest in drugs, drug consumption, the youth culture, all of those things, gangs, etc., that were disturbing, loitering, etc., that were disturbing American society in those years, could be solved by good old-fashioned family values. López Obrador, same thing. Reagan isn't usually considered a president of the left.
In analysis of the criminal economy, we see certain labels that come up again and again. One of these labels is gang. Another one that is perhaps a favorite among journalists is cartel. How useful are these labels to understand the criminal economy? And could you perhaps summarize a little bit your own analysis? Because you, as you explain in your book, there appears to be a regional economy. So I know this is very complex, but perhaps if you could try to summarize your thoughts on this for our listeners.
I mean, first, there have been a number of analysts, important analysts, who have criticized deeply the notion of the cartel. And they're right. But I don't actually subscribe. They're right because, well, first of all, the word is imported from Colombia, so it doesn't really, to Mexico, it's imported from Colombia, along with terms like sicario. And there's a whole vocabulary that moves into Mexico together with the cocaine economy that is imported, and it wasn't what was valent in the older drug economy in Mexico. So in part there's that. In part, the war on drugs requires, that is the 2006 declaration of the war on drugs, required the construction of a very neatly representable enemy. And so the use of the cartel and of the narco as a prototype and all of that was actually something that the government's policies leaned on, as well as the media's feeding on the violence. Say nothing of U.S. foreign policy around that. All of them is required, let's say, the stabilization of the image of the kingpin, of the cartel, etc. And so there are very good reasons to be skeptical about the validity of the term. I nevertheless use it because I do think that actually something did transpire at a social organizational level with the development of these economies, and that you have multiple social organizational forms that are relevant when you want to analyze these kinds of economies. And the cartel I use the term because it is now used by everyone. That is, the organizations themselves use it, right? So it's now a local term. It's not simply slapped on by the state or by the media. It's also social actors themselves who use it. It does refer to something that is slightly different from the kinds of social organizational forms that were dedicated to the drug economy, let's say in the 1970s or in the 1960s. What is different about it? Well, first of all, there's a proletariat there now. That is, it's not just a family business. It's a business that has a lot of employees. And those employees, many of them are quite low-level operators. Many of them are, whatever. Many of them, first of all, there's often, let's say, they're not full-time employees. Most of them aren't full-time employees, and most of them are occasional, but they're also full-time employees, both. And those include, jobs like lookout or jobs like hitman or jobs of various kinds. Those are the most prominent, hitman and lookout, but there are, more specialized jobs as well, chemists, accountants, etc. So it does involve a much more complicated economy, but it also involves an articulation between, which is very hard to understand, and I don't understand it very fully myself. But an articulation between more or less coordinated capacity to move across broad territories with the delegation of all kinds of functions to people who are not part of the cartel. And when this is kind of hard to analyze in my book. I use some cases that come from court cases in the U.S. because court cases in Mexico are not, publicly available for the most part. And in the U.S., they're not only publicly available, but they're also even searchable, so you can actually do with a relatively thin research, like the kind that I do there. You can still find interesting cases. And let me give you a case just so that people understand what I'm talking about. There was a time in the late 2000s or 2008, 2009, 2010, when an organization known as the Gulf Cartel, which was one of the first big players in moving Colombian cocaine through Mexico into the U.S., split off from one of its units, the Zetas, that it had created, which is a kind of Praetorian Guard made up of former Mexican military, special ops military. And so this split happens, and it's a terrible split, as these things are when they happen. Internal rifts are extremely violent because they know each other, they know where they live, and it's easier to, it becomes a bloodbath. And this was a terrible bloodbath. And when these battles were raging, 2009, 2010, 2011, the Gulf Cartel lost some of its shipments of marijuana and drugs in the U.S. And then when they recovered some power in the city of Reynosa and Matamoros, they tried to recover some of those lost drugs. And this is a little court case in Texas where it turned out that what they did, they had lost a truck full of marijuana, and they wanted to recover it, but they didn't really have the territorial power to recover it in these like Texas border towns. So they went to a prison mafia in Texas. I can't remember where, in El Paso or in San Antonio. I don't remember. And they farmed out, they doled out the job, and the prison mafia then contacted a local neighborhood gang that did actually find the marijuana, and then let's say the gang members were not very disciplined, and they got involved in a shootout with the people who had the truck, and so the police came in, put them all in jail, and that's how I found out about it. But because it's in the court case, but it's an example of what is a cartel there. The prison mafia in Texas is not part of the cartel. They just know each other. The local neighborhood gang that found the marijuana for the prison gang, in order for them to charge the Gulf Cartel money, was also not part of the prison gang, although it was connected to it. So you have a system, let's say, of outsourcing that is actually quite complex and about which we don't know enough, but we could know much more, actually. And this kind of consideration needs to be taken seriously when you think of something like the cartel, because the image of the cartel is often as if you were talking about Walmart that I mentioned, and it's not exactly that.
Let's turn to one of your central arguments in your book, which concerns the state form in Mexico. Perhaps people might think of the state as something monolithic with a clear chain of command, but you argue that there are empirical examples which demonstrate to us that this is not the case. And what you say in your book is there is currently in Mexico much sovereignty, but little administration of justice. And added to that, you also argue that the violence that we're seeing is not a symptom of a failed state, but an attribute of a new kind of state. So could you outline to us what this new state looks like?
Yeah, the first characteristic that is something I call the state estranged from itself, which sounds a little bit schizophrenic. It is a little bit schizophrenic, but here's what I mean. Usually we think of the state in two kinds of ways. Political scientists have thought about it in two kinds of ways. One is a kind of bundle of institutions, and the other is a bundle of institutions, yes, but that has a kind of, let's call it a mask of, or an attribute, a desire, a pulsation for sovereignty. That is the ability for that bunch of institutions to act in a coordinated fashion according to some will. Popular sovereignty, for example, is an idea that involves some way of moving between that, people's will, general will, to the state, either through, for example, a charismatic leader. In the case of a Latin American caudillismo in the 19th century, or populism in the 20th century, that idea was a somewhat Jacobin idea, that is unmediated sovereignty. The caudillo stood for the people, was part of the people, an embodiment of the people. López Obrador had this idea about himself. When he said things like, for instance, yo ya no me debo a mí mismo. I no longer own myself. I now owe myself to the people. That meaning that he no longer had private interests, that all of his interests were the same as the people's interests. That is a very classic formulation, a Jacobin formulation, that we've had in Latin America since the time of Bolívar. And it's not new in Latin America. It's not at all new. There's nothing original about it. It's old, right? What's surprising about it is that it's old, not that it's new. So we have these two ideas of the state. The state is something that is sentient, individual-like, capable of making decisions. And the state as a quite large, more or less coherent, more or less incoherent group of institutions. What I mean by the state estranged with itself, which I think has been a characteristic of the Mexican state in these past decades, is two things. One, when the institutions are incapable of coordinating one with the other. And we have lots of examples of that around the question of policing. In Mexico, it's actually not that unusual to hear about a shootout, for instance, between a municipal police force and a state police force. Or when there was a federal police, the federal police, or the army and the police force. There was a recent paper published that the name of the author just slipped me, a Mexican political scientist who works in the UK, and I apologize, they forget names a lot, who did a study of some of the cases of torture that the military were involved in, that the Human Rights Commission had documented, 10 or 15 years ago. And several, there were like 70 cases or something that had been documented, and like a tenth of them were cases of the military torturing members of the police. So, so that's one sense of the state strange with itself, like a disjointedness, lack of coordination between the institutions, and especially between local level, state level, federal level institutions. The second sense is when the sovereign, that is in the case of Mexico, the president, whose power has become more and more concentrated, no longer recognizes or understands how the government works, looks at the government, says, I don't even know what this is. During the Felipe Calderón period that you mentioned, that is the war on drugs period, that was the case between the federal government and the police. The police generally was seen as like an anomaly. Well, how do we control this? We cannot control it, as if the police were not part of the state. Under López Obrador, the bureaucracy as a whole was represented that way. López Obrador just talked about the Mexican bureaucracy, Mexico's government, in other words, as a quote, as an elephant with emphysema, that he couldn't move the elephant. And that's how he justified militarization. That's why according to him, why he gave, for example, major public works like the airport that he built or the train, the Maya train, to the military, because he didn't trust the bureaucracy to do it. So that is what I mean by concentrated sovereignty and diminished regulatory capacity. When the president no longer recognizes the state, the bureaucracy, which he's a part of, as something that can actually be mobilized in favor of the interests of the sovereign. And these two forms of estrangement, the lack of coordination between institutions and the lack of identification between the president and state institutions, have been rife in Mexico and have been, let's say, a constant source of breastbeating on the part of politicians, and particularly on the part of presidents, but not only, also governors, etc. And what it's showing you is that there's a sort of decentralization of security, of protection, to use a term that you raised earlier.
I'd like to invite a final reflection from you about the public sphere. In your book, Sovereignty and Extortion, you write, today in Mexico, there's a lot of protest and very little state response. Perhaps we might counter that, yes, there is protest, but perhaps in certain moments when something particularly outrageous has happened, and then this outrage becomes immobilized after a while, because there's so much violence and people become accustomed to violence and the criminality behind much of it. My question to you is, if the state at the moment is failing at protecting human rights, at providing justice, how might we, from academia, from civil society, try to impact public discussion in order to create pressure and move the state more towards fulfilling these functions in terms of protecting human rights and delivering justice?
Well, I think it's failing miserably in both of those. That is, protecting human rights and delivering justice terribly. And part of the issue, in my opinion, though I may be wrong, I'm not much of a prophet, but that's you asked for my opinion, so I'm giving it to you. Is that the democratic transition in Mexico invested extremely heavily, a lot of money actually, in making elections believable. Mexico never had, fair elections before the democratic transition, which doesn't mean that none of the people who won elections didn't win them, but it was just there was not a credible system of electoral system either in the 20th century or in the 19th century. The Mexican transition invested everything in this, but they didn't really invest heavily in overhauling the judicial apparatus. And the judicial apparatus, I don't mean just the judges or anything like that. I mean the whole thing. That is the police, the investigative police. There is no investigation in Mexico. I mean, it's interesting. Mexico is a country that has these huge, I mean, really flabbergasting levels of impunity when you look at how many, serious prosecution of serious crimes, murders, disappearances, kidnappings, rapes, all of that is, the figures, I'm bad at figures, but the figures are in the 90-some percentile, 94%. Of them, officially almost around 120,000 disappeared in Mexico. How many cases of disappearances have been solved? Last I heard, there were like 40, and so basically you have a system of impunity, but at the same time that you have impunity actually doesn't describe what we have in Mexico, because you have mass incarceration. So somebody's getting punished. It's not that there is impunity. It's that there is that the relationship between punishment and justice is completely opaque. And if you want to create a more a predictable, fair, less classist, a system of justice, you're going to have to invest heavily in that. And for some reason, the image of democratic transition in Mexico was all tied up with elections and really not at all tied up with justice. As a result, nobody's really invested in it because it's extremely costly. And they haven't wanted to do that. They haven't wanted to spend. They haven't minded spending everything on the military. That they're fine with. Why? Because the military is controlled by the president. But the justice system has been, sort of languishing there with tepid reform attempts, not unexisting, not entirely, it's not that they did nothing, but most of what they did was really at the level of the judges and not very much at the level of, let's say, criminal investigation, the professionalism of let's say forensic work, controlling the prisons, Mexico's prisons, with very few exceptions, are all in the hands of of the cartels, of various prison gangs, whatever. So that's the justice system. And I believe that in order to address these issues that you raise, we have to give a good hard look at the social and economic investments that would be needed, concerted effort, multi-year concerted effort in this direction. I don't think any government, there's not been a single government that has really done that. There have been some that have done some gestures, there are some that have not done anything, but that's where we are.
Claudio Lomnitz, anthropologist and professor at Columbia University, thank you for joining me to talk about the criminal economy and the state in Mexico. This is Common Ground. I'm Sonja Wolf. Thank you.
Thank you.